Did you know that Dutch DNA is so unique, even modern science struggles to define it? Imagine taking a DNA test, expecting to see 100% Dutch pop up on your results. But instead, you discover that you're part German, part French, maybe even a little Scandinavian. Sounds confusing, right? But here's the twist. It's not a mistake. In fact, this surprising result is just the tip of the iceberg. Dutch DNA isn't easily boxed into one category because it carries the echoes of ancient migrations, Viking raids, medieval trade routes, and even hidden royal bloodlines. What if I told you that the story of Dutch DNA stretches back thousands of years, long before borders existed, when the land we now call the Netherlands was a crossroads for different cultures and civilizations? This DNA isn't just about where people lived. It's a map of history written in our genes. From the waves of Germanic tribes that crossed into Europe to the fierce Viking warriors who settled along the Dutch coast, every piece of this puzzle adds up to a story more fascinating than you could ever imagine. But here's the real question. How can a tiny country like the Netherlands hold such a massive genetic mystery? And why does modern science still struggle to decode it? The answers lie hidden in your DNA, waiting to be discovered. When most people think about DNA, they expect clear answers. You take a test, and it tells you exactly where your ancestors came from, right? But what if I told you that when it comes to Dutch DNA, things aren't that simple? In fact, Dutch people often get results that leave them scratching their heads. Instead of showing Dutch, their DNA tests say they are German, French, or even Scandinavian. This isn't a glitch in the system. It's a clue to a much bigger mystery that's hiding in plain sight. Think about it. How can people who've lived in the same region for generations have such mixed DNA results? The answer lies in the history of the Netherlands itself. The country we know today as the Netherlands didn't exist the same way thousands of years ago. There were no borders, no neat lines separating one group from another. People moved freely. Traders, warriors, refugees, and farmers, all crossing paths, settling down, and blending their cultures and, of course, their genes. The Netherlands was never an isolated land. It was a crossroads, a place where the North Sea acted as a highway, not a barrier. This sea connected the Dutch to Vikings from the north, Germanic tribes from the east, and traders from the south. Over time, all these interactions created a rich, complex genetic tapestry that modern science is still trying to unravel. But why does this matter? Because Dutch DNA isn't just a story about the Netherlands. It's a story about Europe, about how borders shift, cultures merge, and people adapt. It challenges the idea that our identities are fixed or simple. Instead, it shows us that who we are is shaped by thousands of years of history, written in our very genes. The story of Dutch DNA begins long before the Netherlands even existed. To understand what makes it so unique, we have to travel back thousands of years, to a time when early humans were migrating out of Africa. These ancient people spread across Europe, carrying with them the first genetic markers that would form the foundation of the Dutch gene pool. But this was just the beginning of an incredible journey. As these early humans settled, they lived as hunter-gatherers, surviving off the land. Then, around 6,000 years ago, a new wave of people arrived, farmers from the Neolithic period. These farmers brought not just new tools and ways of living, but also new genes. They mixed with the local hunter-gatherers, creating the first layer of what we now recognize as Dutch DNA. This blend of ancient populations set the stage for even more genetic diversity to come. Fast forward to the time of the Great Migrations, when Germanic tribes, Franks, and Saxons moved across Europe. These weren't small, isolated groups. They were massive movements of people that reshaped the continent. The ancestors of the Dutch were part of this story, living alongside these tribes, trading with them, and sometimes even fighting them. Each interaction left a mark, adding new threads to the genetic tapestry of the region. But Dutch DNA isn't just about ancient history. It's a reflection of how people have always moved, mixed, and adapted. Every migration, every settlement, every generation added another layer, making Dutch DNA one of the most fascinating genetic stories in Europe. It's a journey through time, written not in books, but in the very code of life itself. When you think of Vikings, you probably imagine fierce warriors sailing across rough seas, raiding villages, and leaving behind tales of adventure. But what if I told you that the Vikings left behind more than just stories? They left their mark in the DNA of the Dutch people. Yes, hidden deep within Dutch genes are traces of Viking ancestry, quietly passed down through generations, even though most people have no idea it's there. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking raiders set their sights on the coastal regions of what is now the Netherlands. Areas like Friesland, Groningen, and North Holland were prime targets because of their easy access from the North Sea. The Vikings didn't just raid and move on. They settled, integrated with local communities, and started families. Over time, their genetic legacy became woven into the Dutch population, creating subtle but lasting imprints in the DNA of people living in these regions today. Modern DNA studies reveal that people from these coastal areas often carry markers that are linked to Scandinavian ancestry. But it's not always easy to spot. The blending of Viking genes with local populations over centuries has made these traces faint, like echoes from the past. You might not see it on the surface, but it's there, hidden in the very fabric of Dutch DNA. What's even more fascinating is how this Viking influence connects the Netherlands to the broader history of Northern Europe. It's a reminder that the Dutch weren't just passive bystanders in history. They were part of a larger story of exploration, conquest, and cultural exchange. So, the next time you hear tales of Vikings, remember, their legacy isn't just in the sagas, it might be in your genes. The Middle Ages were a time of castles, knights, and kingdoms rising and falling. But beneath all the epic battles and royal dramas, something even more fascinating was happening. People were moving. Not just armies, but families, traders, and entire communities shifting across Europe, leaving behind a trail written in their DNA. The Netherlands, sitting right at the crossroads of Europe, became a melting pot during this period, and the evidence is hidden in the genes of the Dutch people today. One of the most intriguing genetic connections comes from the 11th century. You'd expect Dutch people to be most closely related to their neighbors in the Netherlands, right? But here's the surprise. DNA studies show that people from Limburg, a province in the south, are genetically closer to Germans than to the Dutch from neighboring regions like North Brabant. How is that possible? It turns out that during the Middle Ages, the borders we know today didn't exist the same way. People moved freely across regions, especially through trade routes and marriage alliances, creating deep genetic ties that modern political maps simply can't explain. But the story doesn't stop there. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Netherlands became a refuge for the Huguenots, French Protestants fleeing religious persecution. Many of them settled in Zeeland, bringing with them their language, culture, and, of course, their genes. Today, some Dutch people carry genetic markers that trace back to these French ancestors, adding another layer to the already diverse Dutch genetic mosaic. And then there's the hidden influence of medieval nobility. Some Dutch families can trace their roots back to noble bloodlines, connecting them to royal families across Europe. These connections often go unnoticed because they are buried deep in family trees, but modern DNA testing is starting to uncover them, revealing surprising links to medieval kings and queens. What makes Dutch DNA so unique is this incredible blend, a mix of ancient Germanic tribes, French refugees, noble bloodlines, and local communities that have lived in the same place for centuries. It's not just a genetic code, it's a living history book, telling the story of migrations, resilience, and the unexpected connections that shaped the Dutch people. When we think of highways, we picture roads connecting cities, filled with cars and bustling with people. But long before modern highways existed, there was the North Sea, a vast, open waterway that acted as one of the most important superhighways in European history. Far from being a barrier, the North Sea connected the Netherlands to the rest of Europe, and its influence is etched not just in history books, but in the very DNA of the Dutch people. For centuries, the North Sea was a busy route for traders, explorers, fishermen, and even invaders. The Netherlands, with its prime coastal location, became a hub where goods, cultures, and people constantly crossed paths. This wasn't just about trading spices, textiles, or precious metals. It was also about the exchange of ideas, languages, and yes, genes. Every ship that docked in Dutch ports brought new faces, new stories, and new genetic threads that wove into the fabric of the local population. The genetic impact of this maritime highway is undeniable. Dutch DNA carries traces from across Northern Europe, Scandinavian influences from Viking traders and settlers, British and Irish markers from medieval merchants, and Germanic genes from inland travelers who used river routes flowing into the North Sea. These aren't just distant historical facts, their living legacies still present in the DNA of people in the Netherlands today. But the North Sea didn't just bring people in, it also sent them out. Dutch sailors, merchants, and explorers traveled to distant lands, spreading their own genetic footprint across Europe and beyond. The constant movement back and forth created a unique genetic blend, a mosaic that reflects centuries of human connection shaped by the rhythms of the sea. So, when people take DNA tests and are surprised to find traces of Scandinavian, British, or German ancestry in their results, it's not a mistake. It's the story of the North Sea Highway, a story of movement, exchange, and how the tides of history flow not just through time, but through our very genes. When you think about human history, it's easy to imagine people constantly on the move, explorers, traders, and migrants crossing borders and seas. But in the Netherlands, there's another fascinating story written in the DNA of its people, the story of those who stayed. For centuries, many Dutch families remained rooted in the same towns, the same villages, even the same farms, passing down not just their traditions but their genes, creating a genetic time capsule that still exists today. Take Winterswijk, for example, a small town where some families can trace their ancestry back over 1,200 years. Imagine living in the same place where your ancestors lived more than 1,000 years ago. Their DNA, unchanged by the waves of migration that swept across Europe, has been preserved through generations, like a living thread connecting the present to the distant past. This deep genetic continuity is part of what makes Dutch DNA so unique. But while many stayed put, others moved, and their movements reveal surprising patterns. Unlike what you might expect, Dutch migration didn't follow a simple north-south route. Instead, people tended to move east and west, following the paths of rivers like the Rhine, Waal, and Meuse. These rivers weren't just lifelines for trade and transport. They acted as natural barriers, subtly shaping where people settled and how communities evolved over time. People living near these rivers were less likely to cross them, which helped maintain distinct genetic signatures in different regions. What's even more interesting is how DNA studies reveal these patterns today. Researchers have found that Dutch people from different provinces often have distinct genetic markers, reflecting the historical tendency to marry and live within the same communities. Yet, there are also unexpected overlaps, like people from Limburg having closer genetic ties to Germans than to their fellow Dutch from neighboring provinces. This shows how historical migrations, cross-border connections, and even ancient political boundaries left their mark on the Dutch gene pool. In the end, the story of Dutch DNA isn't just about where people went, it's also about where they stayed. It's a story of deep roots and quiet continuity, mixed with moments of movement and change. Whether through generations of farmers living on the same land or families crossing rivers in search of new opportunities, Dutch DNA captures both the stillness and the motion of history, written in the very code of life. Imagine taking a DNA test, eager to uncover your roots, only to be told you're not as Dutch as you thought. Instead of seeing the Netherlands highlighted on the map, you find German, French, Scandinavian, even British ancestry listed in your results. Confusing, right? But here's the thing, it's not a mistake. In fact, the science behind DNA testing explains why Dutch DNA is so tricky to define, and it all comes down to how these tests work. DNA testing companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, and FamilyTree DNA use massive databases to compare your genetic markers with reference populations from around the world. These reference populations are groups of people whose ancestry is believed to be tied to a specific region for many generations. The problem? Dutch DNA doesn't fit neatly into these categories because of the Netherlands' rich and complex history. For centuries, the Netherlands was a hub of migration, trade, and cultural exchange. Its people mixed with Vikings, Germans, French Huguenots, and countless other groups. This genetic blending means Dutch DNA shares many markers with neighboring countries, making it hard to isolate what's uniquely Dutch. Another reason for the confusion is that modern borders don't reflect ancient genetic boundaries. The idea of national DNA is a modern concept, but your genes tell a story that's thousands of years old, long before today's countries existed. Back then, people moved freely across regions, and their DNA spread with them. So, when your test results show a mix of European ancestry, it's not wrong. It's just showing the truth. Your genetic history doesn't care about borders. Even the algorithms used by DNA companies add to the confusion. Different companies have different datasets and methods for analyzing your DNA, which is why you might get varying results from one test to another. One company might label your ancestry as Germanic, while another calls it Northwestern European, even though they are looking at the same genetic markers. What's important to remember is that DNA results aren't about precise labels, they're about patterns. They reveal how your ancestors moved, mixed, and connected across time and space. So, if your results seem unexpected, don't be surprised. It's not that the test is wrong. It's that your DNA is telling a story far more complex than a simple label can capture. When people take a DNA test, they expect to find out simple facts about their ancestry, where their family comes from, maybe a few distant cousins. But sometimes, the results reveal something far more surprising. Hidden stories written in their genes. Dutch DNA, in particular, holds unexpected discoveries that go beyond what any family tree or historical record can show. Imagine thinking you're 100% Dutch, with deep roots in the same village for generations, only to find out that you have Viking ancestry or royal blood from medieval Europe. How is that possible? It all comes down to the fact that history is full of untold stories of migrations, secret relationships, and forgotten ancestors that never made it into the official records. DNA doesn't lie. It carries traces of every connection, every journey, and every mystery from the past, waiting to be uncovered. One common surprise in Dutch DNA is the discovery of unknown ancestors. Many family trees have gaps, illegitimate children, unrecorded adoptions, or simply lost records from times when documentation wasn't as thorough as it is today. These missing pieces often show up in DNA tests, connecting people to relatives they never knew existed. Suddenly, distant cousins appear from different countries, revealing family ties that cross borders and stretch back centuries. Another unexpected discovery comes from noble bloodlines. Some Dutch people are shocked to learn that their DNA links them to European royalty. During the Middle Ages, noble families often had relationships outside of marriage, and their descendants blended into the general population over time. While these connections might have been hidden or forgotten in family histories, they are still there, quietly preserved in the genetic code. And then there's the fascinating case of genetic diversity within small, seemingly isolated communities. Even in villages where families have lived for hundreds of years, DNA reveals a surprising mix of ancestries. This shows that even in the most traditional, close-knit places, there were moments of unexpected connections, travelers passing through, marriages with people from different regions, or ancient migrations that left a lasting mark. The beauty of DNA is that it tells the full story, not just the parts written down in history books. It reveals how interconnected we all are, how borders and family names can't fully capture the complexity of our past. Whether it's discovering Viking roots, royal connections, or long-lost relatives, Dutch DNA is filled with hidden stories just waiting to be found. What makes Dutch DNA truly unique? It's not just about geography or national borders. It's about the extraordinary blend of ancient roots, diverse migrations, and centuries of history woven into the very fabric of Dutch genes. Unlike many other European populations, Dutch DNA tells a story of both deep stability and constant change, a rare combination that makes it stand out in fascinating ways. For starters, there's the remarkable genetic continuity. In regions like Winterswijk, some Dutch families have lived in the same villages for over 1,200 years. Their DNA is like a time capsule, preserving the genetic signatures of people who settled there long before the Netherlands even existed as a country. This deep-rooted connection to the land is rare in today's fast-moving world, and it gives Dutch DNA a unique sense of historical depth. But alongside this stability is a history of incredible diversity. The Netherlands has always been a crossroads, a place where cultures, ideas, and people from across Europe met and mixed. From the Viking raids in the north to the Germanic migrations in the east and the Huguenot refugees from France in the south, Dutch DNA is a mosaic of different influences. Each wave of migration added new layers, blending ancient bloodlines with fresh genetic material from far and wide. What's even more fascinating is how Dutch DNA defies modern borders. You'd think that DNA would neatly match national lines, but that's not the case. Genetic markers found in the Dutch population are shared with Germans, Belgians, Scandinavians, and even the British. This overlap reflects a history where people moved freely, long before borders were drawn, creating connections that are still visible in our genes today. Another unique feature of Dutch DNA is how it reveals unexpected stories. It's not just about ancient migrations or distant ancestors. It's about the hidden threads that connect people across time and space. Royal bloodlines tucked away in family trees, unknown relatives discovered through DNA matches, and even ancient Viking ancestry hiding in plain sight. Every Dutch person's DNA is like a map, filled with surprises waiting to be uncovered. In the end, what makes Dutch DNA truly unique is its complexity. It's a story of resilience and movement, of deep roots and wide-reaching branches. It's proof that our identities are shaped by both the places we come from and the journeys our ancestors took. Dutch DNA isn't just a set of genetic markers. It's a living history book, written in the language of our genes. So, what does Dutch DNA really tell us? It's not just about where you're from. It's about the journeys, the migrations, and the hidden connections that have shaped who you are today. Every strand of Dutch DNA is like a page from an ancient book, filled with stories that stretch back thousands of years. It's a story written not with words, but in the very code of life passed down through generations. Think about it. Your DNA carries the echoes of Viking raiders who once sailed the North Sea, of Germanic tribes that crossed borders long before maps existed, of French Huguenots seeking refuge, and of noble families whose bloodlines quietly blended into everyday communities. Even in the smallest Dutch villages, where families have lived for over 1,000 years, hidden genetic surprises reveal connections to distant lands and forgotten ancestors. But Dutch DNA isn't just about the past. It's a living reminder of how interconnected we all are. While borders, languages, and cultures may change over time, our genes carry the memories of those who came before us, memories of love, survival, movement, and resilience. It shows us that history isn't something that happened to other people. It's something we carry within us. So the next time you think about your heritage, remember, it's more than just a place on the map. It's a story written in your genes, a story of adventure, migration, and connection that stretches back further than you ever imagined. Your DNA is not just who you are. It's the history of the world, told through the people who made you, generation after generation. If you've enjoyed uncovering the fascinating story of Dutch DNA, now it's your turn to join the conversation. What's the most surprising thing you've learned about Dutch genetics today? Was it the Viking connections, the hidden noble bloodlines, or the idea that borders don't define our ancestry the way we thought? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your discoveries and reflections. And if you're as curious about history, migration, and the hidden stories in our genes as we are, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of our past, because there's always another story waiting to be uncovered. Who knows? Your DNA might be hiding the next great discovery. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.